All right, so here we are. We're going to do the episode 2 of the Grim Wisdom podcast. Call it Grim Wisdom because the idea is we're going to enlighten you and we're just going to expand the scope of your misery and incomprehension. So if that's the way you feel at the end of this podcast, we will have done our jobs. With me tonight is Sean Hawley, who's going to be helping me out here as we discuss a number of weighty topics.
Yes, sir.
All right, great. Let's see. Got some feedback from the last show. Should swear less, so I'll work on that. And then let's see. Yeah, right. That's a bunch of shit. No, forgive me. We won't be saying those sorts of things if we can help it. I feel like bullshit is a separate word, though. There's really no other way to describe the concept. I could have said balderdash, but
it's not really current with the times.
Right. I mean, what is this? A Disney Channel podcast? I mean, come on.
My daughter is in the background playing video games, so we should probably keep that in mind.
Oh, yeah, okay. Like, you never cussed around her anyway.
Not on mic.
This is true. Not where people can...
Not where people can prove it.
Keep your bad parenting episodes outside of the limelight where there is no evidence. Yes.
Right.
Okay, so don't be like that woman down in Florida whose 4-year-old shot her. You hear about that?
I think I saw the headline. I didn't know anything about it.
Well, I mean,
it's the story of my news comprehension. Anyways, I read headlines and never read articles.
I mean, that's pretty much a parenting epic fail right there. But all right, we're getting far afield here. So That was one piece of feedback, and so Sean and I we're going to talk about economic equality, the upcoming economic inequality. Thank you. Minor difference there.
Minor.
Coming ecological, environmental, political, cultural disaster, and the implausibility of a popular revolution that you realized by voting. And my buddy Rory also wanted us to talk about magic cards, so throwing a bit about that. So let's start with the hardest one first. I think let's talk about magic cards.
Okay.
Yeah, let's just get that out of the way. Yep. As a sop to Rory. So it is interesting that. It's this weird business model where people spend so much money on these cards, Meaning you can't just buy cards and be done with it. You have to keep buying cards, and there is a digital game, but the digital cards cost as much as the actual physical cards. It's just sort of mind-blowing when you think about it. And the cost, the marginal cost of a card is zero, right? I mean, it's literally zero once you have a card that you've concepted. Once you had those sunk costs to come up with the card and test the card, then to produce 1 million digital copies of that card costs you no more than producing.
Oh, right. The cost of the digital product versus the physical product.
Right. Well, and even the physical product, I mean, it doesn't really cost very much at all.
Much, but it actually has some production costs.
Right. It has some production costs, but the point I'm trying to make is it does relate back to something that I've talked about before, which is intellectual property rights and how stuff never enters the public domain anymore unless they've created this whole new architecture to re-establish public domain now in a world that does not assume it, called Creative Commons, which I don't know if anybody else here is aware of it. Sean, have you looked into this at all?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Basically, because capitalism is insane about making everything somebody's property and that somebody is always a rich person, your art is assumed to be your exclusive property and the exclusive property of your owners or your heirs if you're one of the few people who have no owners. But if you're doing any work at all for a corporation, then they own all of your intellectual property, essentially in perpetuity. I mean, there's technically a deadline of some 125 years. But, when that comes up and Disney Mouse and Mickey Mouse threatens to enter the public domain, what do you think the chances are that it'll be extended again? I'm going to guess it's about 100% that they'll lobby Congress to get it extended again.
I believe universities have a pretty good lock on this too. They claim intellectual property, claim all their researchers' intellectual property, and even when professors and or researchers have ideas that develop into companies, they do have to cut their university.
Right, because that philosophy major had his philosophy thoughts in our philosophy lab using our philosophy lab equipment.
Right.
So he doesn't even own those thoughts. He just thinks he does. Right. But so anyway, the point is, your heirs, if you have no owners, and only really rich people have no owners, or your owners, if you have owners, have that intellectual property in perpetuity. It never enters the public domain. It never becomes available to the public to use as they see fit. And then you have these things called this thing called fan fiction where fans will just write fiction in a universe they like. But fan fiction is illegal, and if you ever try to monetize it in any significant way, well, then you get hammered with lawsuits. So if you're good at fan fiction and people like what you read, then either you get hired to do the actual universe or you have to rebrand it somehow.
Right.
So 50 Shades of Grey starts out as Twilight fanfic, but of course Twilight is in public domain. And it's interesting because you look at these intellectual properties, these few that are in the public domain, like Sherlock Holmes, for example, which is a tremendously profitable and valuable franchise hundreds of years later, and it's still making money for people. But every time somebody takes that public domain Sherlock Holmes and adds a little twist on it, that new little twist then becomes their property in perpetuity, right? Which is just begging for a lawsuit, because if I say, oh no, my Sherlock wasn't inspired by the BBC show Sherlock, it was only inspired by the whatever it was, Arthur Conan Doyle ones that are the few that are public domain, because some of those aren't even public domain, because Britain changed the laws, I guess. Anyway, so now it's gotten so out of control that if you just want to make some art just for people to use and not care about, then you need special licenses to do that. Because otherwise, even if you don't care about somebody's use, then somebody somewhere will find a way to sue them. Anyway.
You can find a way to sue somebody for anything. So
Well, that's the beauty of our legal system, is if you have enough money, you can write your own laws by suing people and buying judges. But
this is kind of a little far afield of magic, though. So I don't know.
Well, I don't really know much about magic, or care that much. I don't think our viewers care that much, or if we have any viewers. And
we're just paying homage to our friend Rory. So.
Right. Well, he asked for it, so give the people what I want. It's my motto.
Right.
And what the people want is to be enlightened in an unpleasant fashion. At least I assume that's what you want, or why are you listening to this podcast? Go listen to, I don't know,
something else.
What's upbeat and lame? Do we have something that could be the anti-us?
The upbeat and lame? I don't listen to any upbeat and lame podcasts.
Right. Why don't you go listen to the Disney podcast or the Nickelodeon podcast?
I suppose, in the spirit of what you would probably consider upbeat and lame, maybe go listen to a Tony Robbins, Anthony Robbins podcast, or one of his book CD programs or something like that. That's about as anti-Grant as you can get.
I would say watch Fox News, but that's more like grim unwisdom because everything is apocalyptic.
Yeah, that's along the same lines, just different ideological viewpoint.
Yeah, you watch that and you're going to be disenlightened, but okay. Moving on. I think mind that for as much as I feel that it's worth.
As much as you can. Yeah.
And whose podcast is this anyway? So we're going to talk now about economic inequality. So as we all know,
one of Grant's most popular topics of conversation.
Right. I'll have to get when I feel like ranting about something, invariably it's some variation on this. And the reason this ties into the other topics we want to discuss today is because I really feel, and I wouldn't say that everybody I talk to agrees with me, but I do find that when I phrase the situation in this way, that economic inequality is the most immediate threat facing our future. It's the thing that we have to deal with right away. And you talk to environmentalists or futurists, or you talk about these other threats to humanity's future, threats to our future society of varying degrees of plausibility. We talk about environmental collapse, which seems very plausible. We talk about the development of artificial intelligence, which seems somewhat implausible, although some very smart people have been sounding the alarm about that. So, I don't know. Who knows if Stephen Hawking knows anything about anything?
Or anybody.
But right.
I think there's enough people with high degrees of intelligence and knowledge and connection that foresee it happening. That to say it's not plausible, I think is not wanting to deal with a potential reality.
Yeah. Tomorrow Skynet could awaken and the Terminators could enslave us all. It could happen.
It could happen. Yeah.
It's one of the things that could happen. It's
I'd say within like a couple decades period of time, I think the plausibility of it does go up.
Right.
Right. So depending on the time frame you're talking about with any of these topics, like things like economic collapse or environmental collapse, which maybe has a potential shorter time frame. Maybe that's a longer, has a longer horizon than
Right.
some
So
of the other
if we survive the total collapse of our environment,
well, then we have Skynet
Right.
dropping nuclear bombs
right,
on
then
us. to look forward
Skynet's
to.
going to nuke us. Right. But the reason I think we have to deal with economic inequality first, the reason I think that's the biggest issue is because we can't really deal with any of those other issues until we deal with the root cause. And let's face it, the environment has been defiled mainly because of human ignorance, right? But now we're not ignorant, or at least we're not inevitably ignorant, but there's a tremendous amount of money involved in keeping us ignorant, keeping us from doing anything about the environment under the idea of, well, it will damage the economy, it will hurt jobs. And, I think if you can't, like in California, the droughts are so bad that people can't even live there. Meanwhile, Nestle's gobbling up huge amounts of water from California springs and shipping them all around the country to make a profit because there's something weird with the water rights there. I mean, it's just ridiculous how many people's lives need to literally be imperiled for greed before anybody does anything about it. I mean, we could talk about Flint, Michigan. I mean, I don't know what more there is to be said about that. A bunch of children poisoned. Right.
Water supply there.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, never recover.
Mm-hmm.
Permanent damage to their brains. Right. And I think if a terrorist did that, we would probably kill them without trial. We would probably
go to war. Or
probably straight up Bin Laden them. Right. We'd find him and we'd shoot him right in the head. Right. We wouldn't try to
Invade their
take him
country,
alive. Yeah.
Use this as an excuse to take their resources. All sorts of good stuff.
Right. Oh, American imperialism. Oh, we suck. We're the evil alien invaders. So
Just of today.
right. Tomorrow we'll kill each other and then the roaches will rise.
And then a new or the dolphins. They're supposed
Right.
to be pretty smart.
Right, the dolphins. Squid are smarter than dolphins.
Elephants
man.
are supposed to be pretty smart too. Actually.
As soon as those squid learn how to breathe air, we're
screwed.
screwed, dude.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's enough science fiction around that to let's call that.
It came from the deep.
Cthulhu-esque gods coming up from the deep.
Aya, Rai,
The
Gazengaro.
great old ones.
Okay. So I doubt though that Cthulhu will care about economic inequality. So
No, he actually supports it, from what I understand.
I think he's for it. I think he's
He
for
is.
it. So, well, I mean, if you think about it, economic inequality produces people that the global economy has designated disposable, and that would suit the needs of a god who demands human sacrifice, because then those people would be literally disposable.
Right.
So how do we deal with economic inequality? If you're willing to accept that we need to deal with it because we can't solve the environment as long as there's so much money tied up in continuing to defile it, right?
Well, right. Human nature is such that. I mean, you said human. What was the term you used to the rationale for this continuing? Anyway, I would say it's kind of a, you could call it human greed. You could put it back to even like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs stuff. Too many people are not meeting those base needs. Hence, really dealing with the environment. It's not a huge priority.
Right.
Whereas economic inequality is kind of the cause of not meeting those needs in most cases.
Right. I mean, it's really that. I read this interesting analysis recently of Israel and how Israel used to need the Palestinians for slave labor. So there used to be negotiating leverage that the Palestinians had because the Israeli economy was dependent on, in an eerily similar way to the way we're dependent on, these people that are not subject to low wage or labor protections, right? So just as we are dependent on, quote, guest workers, unquote, to pick our crops for us, and we pay them, less than minimum wage, certainly. But then we rail against them when they become illegal immigrants. So too did
Central Americans, who some people want to put a wall up to block out of the country.
Yeah.
We don't build a wall. We don't need those people.
Yeah.
Oh, but then who would, clean, our bathrooms and
Yeah.
all the other things that we task them to do that a lot of certainly middle upper class Americans don't want to do,
Don't want to do.
nor do they want their children to do.
Yep. But so assuming, yeah, so anyway, the story with the Palestinians is, of course, the Israelis used to need them for labor, and so they had some negotiating power. But then the Israelis, their economy continues to become more technologically advanced, and then on top of that, there was this exodus of people from Russia who were Jewish, or at least claimed to be Jewish, in some cases just to get out of Russia. But there was this huge influx of people from Russia and the old Soviet republics who moved to Israel because they were no longer welcome in Russia. And so Israel all of a sudden had a new group of immigrants to exploit for labor and treat as second-class citizens, and they didn't need the Palestinians anymore. And so ever since then, the Palestinians have been essentially disposable people. The Israelis just haven't figured out just exactly how to dispose of them yet, because nobody likes the phrase "final solution." But it's a problem, and the world is just full of these. I mean, you look at the slums around major cities in really every country on earth. America is not an exception, although it's just being a richer country. The slums don't look as bad as they do in other places, but there are certainly underserved neighborhoods in America,
For sure.
where they essentially exist without legal sanction because the residents have been deemed disposable. They survive on sufferance, and we just haven't figured out yet how to get rid of them. But it's on everybody's radar. At some point, it's like when a neighborhood gets gentrified and taken over by rich people, and businesses colonize it to serve their needs. Where do the residents go? Well, who cares, right? Who cares?
They find a new neighborhood to inhabit.
They find a new neighborhood to inhabit, and increasingly there's just not any neighborhoods for them to go to, and they have to pay the costs of moving. And the irony is, the American economy is still dependent on those people for labor, for cheap labor. So you have places like New York City where people are working like 80 hours a week and they're homeless because they're not being paid enough to live anywhere near New York City.
Right.
So, but anyway, so that's economic inequality, and it's a big problem, and it's a problem on a planetary scale. It's particularly irksome in America just because I'm an American, so I bear unique responsibility, I feel like, for America. Obviously, there's nothing I can do about Israel, although I wish America would stop giving them money and nuclear warheads and unflinching support. But ultimately, it's up to the Israelis to choose if they want to be an evil theocracy or if they want to work towards some sort of resolution to the Palestinian problem. But here in America, we have to deal with our own inequality. We have to deal with our own slums, our own racial tensions, and so that leads us to the revolution point. Bernie's been talking about a political revolution. He wants young people all around the country to go out to the polls. And actually, since I decided to talk about this last week,
what happened last time, though?
well, Obama won, but it wasn't. But you can't describe Obama's presidency as revolution because the basic power structure did not change.
Yeah, but I guess my question is wasn't it the same call to action, kind of getting younger voters out and I don't know minority voters and whatnot to call for this, and obviously so I guess the question becomes how many people can ask this of the population and not follow through or not produce what's promised.
Well, and that's kind of the point I'm getting at actually, is that you can't. A revolution, by definition, is a transformative event. It alters the basic power structure. But our power structure has given you a, quote, vote, unquote. You can't see, but I'm doing air quotes.
Right.
So you can vote. Of course, your vote may very well be meaningless. In fact, almost certainly is meaningless. But you can vote. You can go and you can exercise your power in this small way that the system has allotted you. Well, you can't transform a system by participating in it, right? So you see there are some things on the fringes that you can do to sort of modify what's going on. Like in Ohio, there's some lawsuits going ahead, which Sean probably isn't aware of, but in Ohio, there's some lawsuits going ahead because there's 17-year-olds who are going to be 18 by election day, and they want to vote. And the Secretary of State's saying, no way, because you'll vote for Democrats, and we can't have that because I'm not one. And he's also closed early voting and everything he can to restrict voting. And this, too, is the first year that we won't have the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And many states have already put together measures that are more or less blatantly designed to keep minorities from voting. No state is requiring you to pay for a state-issued ID. But there have been some really crazy stories about people where, they won't give them the ID without a birth certificate. And they'll only give it to them if they come in person to a DMV. And that could be a real physical and financial hardship for an 80-year-old who lives 40 miles away from the nearest DMV because you close the one in their town because it's a minority town. You don't want minority people to have access to the polling places, which is a very real description of what's happened in several southern states. So, and we're already hearing horror stories about 80 and 90-year-old people who have voted every election they could, where they've been denied a state-issued ID because they don't have their birth certificate, and they can't get their birth certificate because when they were born was 90 freaking years ago, right? And the hospital that replaced the hospital that replaced the hospital where they were born doesn't have the records, so they can't reissue a birth certificate. So you need a judge to determine that you are a legal person, right? Which means you need to buy an attorney, right? Which means that you can't vote. And so in some of those cases, in some of the more egregious cases, they said, okay, well, we're going to let this one person vote because it's bad optics, but that obviously doesn't change the fundamental dynamic of the situation. So the overarching point here, I know I tend to go on, is that if you want to transform the system, you can't transform the system from by voting, because the system has given you the vote because they know how to manipulate it. So I just don't see a way that we're going to get a fundamental change of the power dynamic from the powerful to the powerless by voting. At best, if we get Bernie in and a bunch of other things happen, we might see a slight shift in things, but improving the top tax rate from 39.5 or whatever, 6 or whatever it is, to 45, that'd be a step in the right direction, but a step in the right direction isn't revolution. It isn't transformation.
Sure. I mean, I guess that's been my concern around, the Bernie Sanders campaign is even if he were to get elected, how far can he really move the needle, in the current political structure? So.
Right, and obviously, as a voter, that shouldn't really be your primary concern. Because,
sure. I mean,
if the winds are blowing against you, you can't sail directly into a headwind, right? So the best you can do is stand still, right? Mm-hmm. But there are some people who will say, well, let's just let the winds blow us wherever they may, right? Like, I think Hillary Clinton is more of a blow us wherever they may kind of person, whereas Bernie might drop the anchor. So it's not as if it's better to vote for Hillary because she'll move the country more. She'll move the country more in the wrong direction.
No, I wasn't suggesting that. I guess, as you said earlier, with or as we kind of talked about earlier, with just the state of the world and economic inequality, it's hard for me to believe that any candidate in the current power structure is gonna move the needle. I mean, I could even say that to somebody who wanted to vote for Donald Trump, or who wanted to vote the completely opposite way. How much are they going to move the needle in that direction either? It seems like we're stuck with this current power structure that's preventing almost things from going either way. So that's just.
Yeah, I mean, I think say what you will about Donald Trump. I mean, he appeals to.
A lot has been said.
And a lot has been said, and a lot should be said. I mean, really, we should be calling him Drumpf, because that's his name, right?
That's what I hear.
Well, he should embrace his heritage, but whatever. I mean, he's egomaniac and a hypocrite. I mean, who cares what he thinks? But anyway,
Well, lots of people do. He's
Right, I mean,
got a
it
bit of a
doesn't
following.
matter. It doesn't matter whether you call him Trump or Drump. He's a douche either way. Right? Does douche count as a swear word? I don't know. So
I think you're on the good side of the line so far. Good job.
good work. Good work. I get a cookie. So, but there is this popular outrage that's clearly propelling Trump, and that honestly, I think. It's the secret to Bernie's success, but also to the extent that Hillary has success, it's the secret of her success as well, because she's, to you and I, she's obviously not a transformational candidate, right? Because I think we pay more attention to the kinds of things that would, because of our background as financial planners. I mean, I'm not one now, but I used to be, and Sean is. Just because of our background, we pay more attention to things like Wall Street, how she's financed, where her power comes from. And so I think we agree she won't be transformational, but she's done a good job as branding herself as transformational. I mean, if you look at any of her advertising, it's on and on and on about how, isn't it time for a woman's perspective, blah, 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 which is ironic considering that which is ironic considering that we tried really hard to draft Elizabeth Warren to be our candidate. I mean, Bernie Sanders was a distant second for most of us on the left wing of the Democratic Party, but we couldn't get her to run. So I would agree that I'd like to vote for a woman. All things being equal, I'd prefer to vote for a woman, but not this woman against this man. But there are plenty of people out there that see, oh, well, if we get in a woman, it's going to be transformational and she's going to understand America better.
Right. I don't see her certainly as initiating any sort of political revolution.
No.
She seems, that's been my argument against Hillary, is she seems a bit too much a part of the old guard, the old political guard that, she just really supports not making any change, more so, regardless of her gender. Her gender really is almost irrelevant here.
Yeah, basically. And I don't want to go too far that line of thinking because, like I said, I would prefer to vote for a woman candidate, all things being equal.
Sure.
You stack up two candidates, they're identical in all respects except one is female. I'm going to vote for the woman, right? But Hillary's just not that woman. But this is
right.
But one thing that you said I think is very interesting, and it leads into the final thing we want to talk about as we're approaching the end of the podcast here, which is you mentioned that she's part of the old guard. That she's known. And there's this clear outrage against all things known. All politicians that you've heard of must be bad, right? Anyone who's a lawyer and who served on Capitol Hill is inherently corrupt. And we've seen anyone who hasn't done that. Because if we keep voting for career politicians, we're going to keep getting the kind of politics we get. And that reasoning is the exact same reasoning I hear people use to talk about Donald Trump as they talk about Bernie Sanders.
Right.
As quite a few Hillary boosters talk about Hillary, I mean, as hard as it is sometimes for us Sanders voters to concede, because we don't see her as anything new, but clearly they do. And that's the thing that people want this election cycle, is they desperately want something new.
Well, they wanted something new last election cycle. So now I think at this point, it's almost like the more out of the ordinary a candidate is, it's like the higher following they get. I mean, I think, like we said, that's really what's fueling Trump's, popularity, is just how he's perceived as the non-politician. It's almost it doesn't matter what he is. He's just a non-politician.
It really is. Like there's a Trump fan at work. I mean, I work with a bunch of friggin' Republicans who will probably eventually find this YouTube video. So
I was about to say.
Sorry guys, but you are. And some of them are Trump fans, and it's crazy because that's exactly the argument they advance. They don't really know anything or care anything about his policies. They just know he's different, and that's good.
Right.
Right. And he tells everybody that he's the greatest guy ever, and some people believe that.
I'm skeptical, obviously, given his past history. He said he talks a good game at times, but it's just I have a hard time trusting somebody who you've kind of followed along his whole life. He's been in the public eye his whole life, so it's not like we don't know about Donald Trump.
Yeah, we know.
We know about
we
Donald
know.
Trump.
But so I wanted to mention just briefly, since we've talked about it, this feeling, this ominous feeling about the future, this feeling that in the future, in the not too distant future, things are going to be a lot worse than they even are now, and things are pretty much worse now than they've ever been. That general feeling seems to cut across all levels of the political spectrum. You know, I mean, we've talked before about how your father, just as an example, I mean, he's probably, I would call him lower upper class. He'd probably call himself upper middle class, but he's right in that range, you know. And he's pretty conservative, right? And he's mainly an economic conservative, I would say. Would you say that's a fair characterization of him? I don't think he's primarily concerned with social issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say he falls on that side of the spectrum, sure.
Yeah, and you know, you and I obviously pretty liberal, so we butted heads with him before, but it's interesting because
Well, you've butted heads with him a little more than I have in this regard.
he is your dad. I mean, you have to love him. Whereas, I mean, I don't care. I'll alienate anyone. You tell me a time and a place, I will piss people off. But
that does have precedent.
I came, I saw, I kicked ass. So, but the point is, your dad, he has this sense of foreboding and gloom about the future.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's not obviously not just him. I think there are a number of people I can point to in his age group, you know, in his social, social position in the country. Like a lot of people feel that way. You know, feel similar to him. So yes,
and it's
but he's
not,
an example.
It's not that they all agree on what the root cause is. You know, you'll talk to some people and they think that global warming is a myth concocted by evil liberals. Although thankfully the number of those people is getting smaller every year, but just because the weather just keeps getting weirder, man. It was like 80 today. It's early March. Why is it 80 in Rhode Island?
Yeah, what they say? This was same time last year where we had 3 feet of snow on the
ground.
ground.
Yeah, it's just madness. It's madness. But you know, it's not. But you know, we can talk about the environment. We could talk about inequality. But there are people that don't care at all about that, but still feel like they're on the cusp of this collapse. You know, and it's when you talk to baby boomers, when you talk to them, there's always this sort of over or subtext of guilt, right? Because they'll lecture you on how lazy the generation is, but they also like know in their hearts that they had it easier, right? I mean, they just there's no objective way that they didn't have it easier. College was way less expensive, was way more accessible. You know, jobs paid more in absolute dollars, and there were generally more quality jobs to go around. Social Security, you got it earlier, and it paid more generously than it does now. There's a whole host of things I could point to. So they'll say, oh yeah, you know, kids today, they're so lazy. Millennials, whatever, those darn kids with their cell phones. But at the same time, like, they understand that if confronted with the facts, they'll admit that, yeah, we have it hard, but we should just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But maybe they feel a little twinge of guilt based on how bad the world is. Although even boomers as a class didn't really, like, they didn't do it to us. It's just a thing that happened. I think that human beings probably would have been the same.
I mean, every generation has a new set of challenges. I mean, you know, if we look at boomers, but then boomers, their previous generation to that were like, you know, the generation that experienced the world wars and whatnot. So, I mean, it was like a totally different set of circumstances. I mean, if you really think about it, one of the things that I've seen referenced often is we have a pretty long, and, you know, people have different opinions on this, but for the most part, a lot of our population doesn't understand what it means to be in any sort of volatile social climate, you know, like any type of war climate. You know, I mean, we've been involved in these wars overseas, but we haven't, like, you know, there hasn't been like a world war that's really affected, you know, the last couple generations really to a great degree.
Right. I mean, the last time,
there's been smaller wars, but
I mean, the interesting thing is you could talk about, although we're approaching the end of when I wanted to quit the podcast here, but you could talk about how the system corrects itself. So after Vietnam, which was this gigantic cluster screw, this multi-decade waste of lives and treasure.
Nice non-profane way of putting it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know.
You're doing well.
So, and what was the lesson learned by the people in power? Was it that imperialism is bad? No, that was not the lesson. Was it that wars are not worth what they cost in lives? No, that wasn't the lesson. The lesson was, hey, the draft is really unpopular when there's an actual war. So they didn't get rid of the draft. We still have the selective service, but there's not really any need for it anymore because we're willing to pay whatever it costs to have our war, you know? I mean, that was in the Iraq war under Rumsfeld. He was like, no, we're going to shrink the military, we're going to shrink the military, we're going to shrink the military, but we're going to draft guardsmen, you know, people that signed up to, I don't know, fight floods and fires and other like natural man-made disasters, and we're just going to send them off to Iraq for, you know, years and years at a time, and they don't have the same rights that ordinary servicemen do. So, and when that didn't work, they just hired mercs. You know, what's the starting salary for a merc? It's like $90,000, right? So imagine being in the U.S. Army over there. You know, you're a grunt through basic training. You believe that Iraq is our blood enemy and that God loves America and whatever. And you're making like $20,000 a year. I mean, it's ridiculous how little money these servicemen make. And right next to you is a merc who's a few years older than you, has the same skill set as you, is taking the same risks as you, but is making like $90,000, right? I mean, that's pretty outrageous, that differential. So, I mean, to me, if you can't fight your war, if your war is so unpopular that you need to hire mercs because you can't even conscript enough people through the guard and the draft is really unpopular, then maybe you shouldn't have the war. But that's not how politicians think. You know, that's not how the Bush brothers think. That's not really how Hillary Clinton thinks. The way they think is, hey, either the war is good or the war is bad, and good and bad can be defined as pleases my campaign contributors or plays well on TV. It can be derived in a variety of ways. So we'll just do it, and whatever it costs, that's the right amount of money to spend on it. You know, There's never got to be a question of how much to spend. Every so often we talk, oh, maybe we shouldn't have this much war, but maybe we spend way too much money on the military. I mean, Bernie talks about it. He talks about how we got this money. We can't even give our children fresh water. You know, we can't even keep from poisoning them. We can't protect them from the depredations of corporations looking to pinch tiny fractions of a penny from their operating budget, right? We can't protect our own people from that, let alone healthcare and everything else. But we can bomb the shit out of your country, right? We can kick those Iraqis' asses, even though there was no reason to kick their asses, right? And we'll bomb anyone else who we think needs bombing today, right? It's just sort of, and the idea that anybody that you elect, any way that you're going to change that within the system, you know, any amount of voting is going to change that. To me, seems pretty laughable. I mean, I just saw, this is my closing thought. I just saw Mark Hamill endorse a U.S. Senate candidate. Did you hear about this?
I have not.
Yeah, there's this very silly and kind of awkward video of Mark Hamill endorsing a Senate candidate, and he says something. I think he would be a very forceful candidate, and it's obvious he's trying to be campy, right?
He didn't have any lines in that last movie, so he needed to say something.
Right. We didn't want to pay him to have any lines.
Just stand there.
Right. Just stand there and look ominous. I hope he doesn't die before the next movie comes out, right?
They just got to film all of his scenes in advance.
Right. Okay, we're just going to do some green screen work with you, just in case you bite it. Okay, all right. We'll work you in. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of touching because it was clearly like Mark Hamill was just some guy. I mean, obviously, we all have these heartfelt memories of him from Wing Commander, but and other stuff that he's done. I forget what, but he, on YouTube, he's just some guy endorsing a Senate candidate because he says, "Hey, we really need common sense gun control. This is ridiculous." Right? I told you at the start of the program, lady gets shot by a 4-year-old, a freaking 4-year-old, and there's a bill in like I don't know, Idaho or some other crazy state where they like want to give 4-year-olds guns. That's making national press, and of course all the leadership here in Rhode Island not that we're going to discuss Rhode Island politics, but just take my word for it. They're all endorsed by the NRA, get all this
That
NRA
was
money.
last episode, you know.
Yeah,
It'll
my
come
buddy.
up again.
Yeah, my buddy Sam Bell wrote an expose about how the NRA was violating election laws by bribing candidates. I mean, you know, they just paid their fine and kept doing it. But yeah, I mean, everybody agrees this is a problem, right? I mean, large majorities of the country are for certain kinds of reforms. I mean, you say, hey, should we ban all handguns? Well, there the country isn't with you, right? But if you say, hey, should we maybe limit magazine sizes to 8 and assault rifles? And the whole country's with you. But we can't even get that, you know, because no politician wants to tick off the NRA. And it doesn't even seem to matter. Like, we keep going to the polls. We want politicians to talk about the issues that we care about. And, you know, maybe they talk about them, maybe they don't. Then they get elected and they go back to doing what they always do.
Yep.
Crazy. So if that doesn't depress you, then I don't know what will, and we haven't done our job.
And if it does, then mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. To quote legendary President George W. Bush. So thank you all for listening. Is there anything else you want to say before I say goodbye to all our listeners?
No, I think we covered everything.
All right, and I'm sorry for the podcast here on and long. I think in the future I'm going to try to hold it to no more than 40 minutes, and here we're a minute over. So, but thanks again for sticking with us this whole time, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.